is, yeah, and then I just
It's always Jenny. Yes. It's just my mum. Oh, tell her to Jenny. I didn't notice that. I saw her head and I took her. Yeah, it's okay. I've made a gesture to her.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening as we gather to celebrate the launch of Sarah Holland-Batt's magnificent new collection, Jaguar. Let's begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Jaguar and Turtle people, as well as the traditional owners of the lands on which people are zooming in from tonight. I also pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that we are on unceded. So a little housekeeping before we begin. Anybody in the toilet, you're welcome to use the one upstairs in Avid, or otherwise just out this gate, about 5 minutes to the side, head towards the light, you'll find it there. It seems that some of you have already found the bar. The bar will open after this event until about 8 o'clock, so you're welcome to have another drink and talk about how good this event was. There will also be a signing after the event, and copies are available at the counter. For those of you on Zoom, you will be given a chat box where you're welcome to put any questions that you may have, and also there'll be a link where you can buy a copy of the book online, and if you buy it during this session, we can ask Sarah to sign it for you. There will be a Q&A session. Mindy will let us know when it's time for that, and anybody on Zoom is also welcome to type any questions they may have, and we'll ask those at the end. It's now my pleasure to introduce Sarah Holland-Batt. Sarah is an award-winning poet, editor and critic, and a professor of creative writing at QUT. Her first book won too many awards to mention here tonight. Her second book, The Hazards, also won too many awards to mention here tonight, but I will mention the 2016 Prime Minister's Literary Award for Poetry. She's a recipient of Sidney Myer Creative Fellowship, the W.G. Walker Memorial Fulbright Scholarship, and too many residencies to mention, but we will say Rome and Japan. She's in conversation tonight with Mindy Gill, who is herself a formidable poet, critic, and editor. Mindy's poems have most recently appeared in Griffith Review and the Penguin Book of Indian Poets. Her criticism has been published in Australian Book Review, Sydney Review of Books, and the Engine. She is Australian Book Review's 2021 Rising Star. Before we get things underway, I'd also like to invite Lou Conge from UQP to come up and say a few words.
Adelaide Festival is Sarah's publisher. She's based in Melbourne, and she's asked me to say a few words on her behalf. She writes, firstly, UQP would like to thank the incomparable Adelaide bookstore for hosting this event. Independent bookstores are the beating heart of the community and deserve our support. Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry I can't be there in person for the Brisbane launch of the Jaguar, but we had a very special evening in Melbourne for this book just recently. There's a Sydney launch to come, and Sarah deserves all the launches. Oh. Sarah is a woman of many talents. She's well known as an outstanding teacher and critic, and most recently, advocate for the aged care sector. But I would argue her reputation has been forged by her work as a poet. It is here that her talents are fully evident and where her writing finds few equals. She is truly one of this nation's best living poets, and her exalted position will only be cemented further with this new book, The Jaguar. The exceptional poems in this are bookended by a collection that are a tribute to her father and a testament to what was taken from him and from her by his illness and death. But those poems and many others in this collection are also replete with the joys of life and love and beauty, and the ironies of vicissitudes. You're the smart one. There is a boldness throughout, a self-awareness and a playfulness of language that dazzles and leaves the reader transformed. Don't just take my word for this book's brilliance. An early review in the Australian noted that, and I quote, the poems about her father are among some of the most powerful written on this subject, and many readers will be profoundly affected by it. It's very true. While the poet Maria Takalenda has said, I have no hesitation in describing this as Sarah Holland-Batt's best poetry collection yet, adding that her refusal to compromise its delicious tension with the technical beauty of the work. This collection reveals to us a poet at the height of her powers, and it is an absolute privilege to publish your work at UQP, Sarah. I also wanted to mention that we pressed reprint on this book last week in its first month of publication. application, so congratulations, Sarah. And we'd also like to thank Mindy for this invitation tonight. Thanks, Mindy. And back to Jackie.
We have to do now is to say a video in please make the
Good evening. I am so delighted to be here with you tonight to launch Sarah Holland-Batt's series of poems, The Jaguar. The first time I met Sarah was in 2013 when she took a guest lecture for an undergraduate degree, for an undergraduate class in the first year of my creative writing degree. And I distinctly remember copying down every slide in your PowerPoint and putting the ones that were assessed due experts 2 weeks away, just to write in my black hole statement, which I'm reading from now. The thing that struck me most vividly the first time hearing Sarah speak about literature, and which I still feel in every conversation we have today, even if it's about kind of maybe ending with this, still the Godzilla franchise, Godzilla versus Kong, more believable. You got it. What struck me then, as it does now, is how vital language is to Sarah and how essential it is in every meaning of the word. Because it feels futile to strive for effective metaphor in trying to describe poetry, let alone poetry of this caliber, please instead allow me what I'm about to attempt. Does everyone know the board game Operation, where you have the man and he's in the thing, and he has, I'm getting it, and he has all of those cavities in his body, and you have the tweezers that are connected to the board, and you have to take out each piece, and if it buzzes and if you get the thing, then you lose the game. And it's almost impossible not to lose at least once because it's so difficult to get that tiny little dog-shaped figure out of his pancreas. But Sarah's poems make me think of someone playing a flawless game of Operation. I got her. The poems in the Jaguar are so precise, so short and fearless, that one feels every word that isn't there has been extracted with a clear surgical precision. Sorry, I could read my writing. Sarah has been a teacher and mentor to me, which has also become an extraordinary friend. In the early days of the pandemic in March of 2020, just weeks before we went into lockdown for the first time and that interminable isolation period, Sarah lost her father, Tony Holland-Batt, to Parkinson's disease. I remember one evening I was dropping off a batch of badly made lemon bars to her house because Sarah had just made for me with her sewing machine these cloth masks because we couldn't find any masks. And she fashioned them out of flannel, the handles of some shopping bags, and then also cuts of Qantas pajamas so that there would be 4 layers and government advisable. But I remember later that night she messaged me and she said she couldn't pick them up at the door right away because she'd been in the middle of her father's funeral, which was held on Zoom, back when such a thing was not only unthinkable but also incomprehensible. But in reading the Jaguar, one learns that Sarah has already known incomprehensible grief and has, to an extent, been forged by it. And in fearlessness or bravery or both, has found a language to talk about it, not of it or around it, or how it feels, but how it is. To know mortality and death like this, the long illness of a beloved parent, first as you once knew them, and then for the second time once they pass, is for life to be defined too soon by a before and after. And these poems never shy away from what it means to experience this, I guess, endless cycle of grief. And I'm thinking of the last lines of the poem at Springbrook. These days I forget intimately that my father is dead. For hours, sometimes he lives again. Soon I tell you everything will be washed by rain. The poems in the Jaguar, as Maria Tackland said, refuse to look away from pain, refuse even to metabolize it. They hold it and honor it, because to honor pain and death is to honor every part of life. I am so moved by these poems, which gift us, among many other things, the lesson of bearing witness. The final thing I want to say about the richness of these poems is while they let us into a group so intimately, they also show us how to pay attention to life. To see how a brain on a hospital light box can look like a shaving of white truffle, or notice how the surface of a cold sea might be a skin of cellophane, wrinkling over liquid agate. I've never known someone who loves life as much as Sarah does, or is as hungry for it, who observes and experiences the world so richly for the pleasure of it, almost as if it were a duty, as if she were living in a life for 2 people. Please raise your glasses and join me in a toast. Congratulations, Sarah. The Jaguar's won.
How beautiful. Well, the funny thing is, I was thinking about my first book launch the other night because we had an event celebrating the Thomas Shapcott Prize, and I was thinking back to the young woman I was then, 25 years old, perfectionistic to a fault. And it took me 2 weeks to write the sort of 8-minute speech that I gave, which was completely, nothing to write home about at the time. And I suppose the velocity of my life is such that I haven't actually had time to write a speech this evening. And I was thinking about that and thinking about Dad in I suppose the last few years, the sort of public role that I've played and stepped into, and thinking of what a gift that's been in a very strange way to come into a different form of myself through the loss of Dad and through what we've been through with his experiences in aged care. And it's made me feel quite comfortable just sitting here talking to you really with no notes at all. I want to thank Mindy for that really beautiful speech. And one of the really great joys, I think, of teaching students is that over time they become your colleagues and your friends, and then you have the opportunity to kind of share these moments with people who, one day, we'll be here celebrating your book, and it's a really beautiful thing, I think, to see these generations of students and people you've worked with kind of come through. So I'm thrilled to have this conversation with you, Mindy. I just want to say a few thanks. Thanks to my friends and family, I suppose. This book has had a really long gestation. It's the story in a way of the last 20 years, but a story that took me kind of almost 20 years to start to write. And I think with those profound life events, some writers seem to be able to find the words for them instantly, and other writers, it takes a process of kind of processing what's happening and finding the language for it. And I feel that that's really been my experience with this book. Dad got Parkinson's when I was 18 years old. So it's my entirety of my adult life that we've sort of witnessed this trajectory and witnessed his changing. But probably only in the last 5 years did I manage to sort of begin to really write about it and find a way through literature to see this as something that could be a subject for poetry. And I think there are certain subjects that we're really comfortable with as proper subjects of poetry, love, certain forms of loss, but thinking about aging, death, dying, and cognitive decline, these are difficult topics, I think, to find a poetic entry point to. And so it is really special to be here after that long. I feel like I've thought about these poems for 20 years, but only written them sort of over the last 5. So it feels quite beautiful to have them in a book and to be here to celebrate that. And to celebrate, I can see all these people from different parts of my life, people who've known my dad like Suzanne for a really long time, Mum, and people who've been there for me through those 20 years. And that's also very beautiful as well. So I just want to thank you all, old friends, new friends, and those friends who've really supported me in the last 2 years, particularly since the loss of Dad. It's been a difficult time, like Mindy said, but I felt very grateful for all of you here. So thank you for joining us, and thank you, Mindy, for that beautiful speech, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
So let's start with a different question, but I think since you were talking about when you were at Aria, between then and now, how much has changed, and I guess how the subject matter in a way remains the same, but you're looking at it from a different angle. And I was thinking of the final sequence in My Father's Country, and how, I guess, towards the end of your dad's life, that's when you were kind of learning a lot about your family history and kind of rushing to learn it, and how you, I guess, the fragmentary nature of poetry, how that enables you to talk about what all of those gaps in your history lie. And then maybe we can talk a bit about your grandfather's portrait next.
Yeah, so one of the strange things about Dad's Parkinson's, he wasn't someone who talked a lot about his life in his lifetime. He was fairly private, he had a pretty wretched childhood. He grew up in the war, he lost his own dad when his dad was 8, his mother became an alcoholic in England, and he had a pretty terrible childhood. And basically kind of moved to Australia and decided that he was starting a new life, and that was kind of closing the door on that chapter. And so I never really met anyone that was related to my dad through my life. It was only in the latter years of his Parkinson's when perhaps liberated. You know, it's funny what cognitive decline can do to someone. Yes, you lose memories, but also certain other aspects of your personality become kind of freed or opened. And so Dad started talking about topics that he really never told me about before, including things about our family history. So he mentioned that that his father had been born in India, that we had ancestry through the British Raj, or telling me all of this at, you know, the age of kind of 30, 35 or something like that. I'd never heard any of this before. And so there was a potential unreliability to those stories as well, because they relate into Dad's Parkinson's, and you sort of think, you know, he could tell you things that weren't true, and then he would tell you these things that were highly specific that you'd never heard before. And he was, you know, plucking out names of places in India that I'd never heard. And so it was a very strange thing of losing certain parts of Dad, but also recovering other parts of the family history that I'd never been familiar with before. And so to answer your question, I think the nice thing about poetry is a form. It's a form that allows for silences. It's a form that allows for ambiguity, ellipses, mystery, probably better than prose. You know, prose has a kind of chronological drive. Even if you're playing with the shape of prose, inevitably you're moving from one sentence to another, and there's a kind of momentum to it. In the poem, I feel there is that space to have these vaulting kind of gaps and this sense of silence entering in. And so in working through those stories that Dad told me, inevitably they haven't come to a conclusion, because I could never ask him a forensic kind of interview that would answer all of those questions. So poetry has seemed to be the right place to find some way of reconciling, I suppose, that storytelling without placing a kind of narrative frame around it where it has a sort of an easy conclusion of, oh, well, and that's the end of the story, and those are the facts, because some of those facts are irretrievable. But I also feel very, very grateful that I was able to retrieve what I was able to retrieve. And it was funny, I was sitting on the deck with Dad just one day, and you know, sometimes he'd be in a mood, a storytelling mood, and I wasn't used to that because he didn't really do that when I was a child. He wasn't someone who liked to recount stories from the past. But just this one afternoon, I was sitting with him, and I had my phone with me, and I put the phone on record, and he just started talking. It's kind of quite extraordinary family history, but I'd never heard the names of these people, and they were all very specific. And you know, piece by piece, actually, I found out that elements of that transpired to be true. But it is a funny thing, you know. I think the way we think about cognitive decline is that someone is becoming irretrievably lost, and that it's just a total process of degradation, and that it's only loss. But funnily enough, with Dad, I felt like I gained some things through his decline that I'm not sure he ever might have actually imparted to me as well.
I will ask you to read a poem, but I also just wanted to ask one more thing. I'll make one more comment. I guess thinking about the portrait of your grandfather and how you wrote about it in Aria, and even though it was different context, different for different purpose, what I found very striking was just how you approach it so directly in the Jaguar. You talk about it as if you're really, or the reader is right there, and that veil, I guess, between the reader and the emotion and the poem, that it feels less like you're carefully putting something in front of obscuring it in a way. And I guess the departure of these poems is that you are talking quite directly. And I wondered, is that kind of a reflection of when a grief like this comes, it's like you're compelled to feel that you can't push this kind of thing away in the writing of these poems? Was it the same? Was it just a compulsion to speak directly? Or was it?
I think I grappled with that a lot, because it's something you have to weigh up as a poet, because you end up dragging all the people that you love in your life into your poetry, and inevitably sometimes they're quite annoyed by it, or you know, there's an element of license in writing from life. And I did think very carefully actually about, I think that's probably why it took me so long to write about what had happened. His dad was weighing up the ethics of I suppose the aesthetics of writing about his experience, being aware that I was writing about someone in a state of great vulnerability, and not wanting to romanticize that or lessen the truth of it, which is that it is very confronting. It is a really intense thing to watch someone change in that way, but also recognizing that there is a place for a poetry that witnesses that. And that, I was kind of aware in writing the book that there aren't very many books like this. There aren't very many books of poetry really about decline. There are books of elegy when someone's died and you're reckoning with the whole of a life. But I think I felt that it was hard to find a language for it. That's the first thing. But I did think very carefully about, hopefully I struck that balance of maintaining a kind of dignity, a sense of Dad's full personhood, that while the poems do focus on the latter years of his life, that there is a sense of the rich person there as well. I don't know that that really answers the question about the portrait, but it probably speaks more broadly to that question of how do you weigh out what you give of yourself. I'm happy to give whatever I want of myself, but you're also giving something of someone else in poems like this, and someone who can't speak back, and there's an element of reckoning with that, I think. But ultimately, I felt that I found a way in, and I'm not sure that I have quite the language for what that way in was, but
It's in here.
yeah, it's in there. Yeah.
That being said, would you like to read a poem?
Was there one you wanted me to read in
I've
particular?
got some for later, but
Okay, I'll read a poem. This poem is from the first section, and these are poems that are written sort of in the days, hours, weeks before and after Dad's passing in hospital. And the funny thing about that experience is time in those settings are very mundane. Hospitals are extremely mundane. There's sort of like the terrible biscuits, the bad tea, the horrible lighting. It's a really mundane setting, and then these really profound things are happening in that setting. And you feel as though time is moving, rushing. Someone's life is rushing away from you, but also that it's kind of the most mundane, basic kind of place to be. And it's a very odd kind of experience. I'm sure I see people nodding in the room. Everyone knows that kind of strange, sterile space in which some of the most profound experiences of our life, birth and death, kind of take place. Time remaining. Like rolled beads of mercury, silver bubbles fly up silently in the mineral water by my father's bed. A bag of Hartmann's solution hangs in the air like a sling of trapped rain. A chartreuse teardrop blinks on the infusion pump's screen. The gauge reads, time remaining. In this void of time in which my father remains, I want to say, is remaining, present continuous. He returns to me. Hello, sweetheart, he says blurrily. I'm just trying to get the damn thing working. And as if I can see what he's seeing, I ask, is it plugged in? He says, I'm beginning to wonder. And he's gone again, eyes swiveling through the morphine, rolling in the mulberry velvet of it. And I can see it's true. My father is beginning to wonder. He is at the verge of something he is only starting to comprehend the shape of, as if he's standing at the delta of a huge muddy river mouth where the mackerel-backed sky and water mirror each other's enormities, and the eye cannot find the horizon between them, a demarcation known only to those who wade in, full immersion. It is right that at the end of his life, my father's final feeling is wonder, not awe, not joy, but wonder, the cousin of astonishment and doubt, which in the Old English also means to magnify. The way his time remaining dilates and shrinks is made both infinitesimally small and infinite, a day, an hour, a minute.
I had to desensitize myself by reading this out loud in the days leading up to this, that I would not cry on Zoom. That was actually one of the poems one of the two that I was gonna ask you to read a bit later, with the related question about the thing that I really noticed in these poems was how you captured your father's voice. And obviously I've never heard him speak, but it really felt like the essence of that person was there. And I guess it's kind of what you were saying just before you read the poem about giving someone a full life and the full dignity of having a voice, even if they can't necessarily, conversed about the book. I just wondered if you wanted to talk about that a bit, because in your previous poems, whenever you quoted dialogue from someone else, I always found it was quite sardonic, a little bit sassy, funny. And this is the first time I felt that it's really, the speaker is inhabiting someone else's, like a very dear influence voice.
Yeah, it's funny. Again, Dad's voice kind of came back to me after he died. The things he would say, the habits of speech, the things that, those are the sort of things you pass on. You live with that person in your head, and Mum's nodding at me. There's certain things that we're constantly laughing about when we remember what Dad said. One of the things that cracks Mum and I up constantly is remembering when I was a kid. Dad was anti-religious, I think it's fair to say. He was militantly atheist. He was way ahead of Richard Dawkins. And when the Jehovah's Witness would knock on our door, it's like I can hear Dad saying it in my head. He would answer the door and he would take one look at them and he'd say, "Are you here peddling religion?" And I can just hear it in my head. And it's funny, when someone goes, that aspect of their personality returns to you, and it's sort of something Dad kind of returned to us a little bit before he died, and that's something I wrote about in the book as well. In the week that he was dying, he became a little bit more like himself, because they take you off all your medication, as you're going on to morphine. So he's off all of his Parkinson's medication, off the sort of huge roster of meds, and funnily enough, with all of that gone, subtracted, and just on morphine, he was saying things that really reminded me of the person he'd been 20 years ago. And that kind of dialogue, I'm loath to say the poems are totally memoir. There's always an element of invention. There's always a veil of fiction over a poem. But those little pieces of dialogue are exactly verbatim what he said to me in the hospital room, where I could just imagine that in his head he was in his study working on a problem on his computer, and that's exactly the sort of thing he would have been thinking of, even though he's just lying in bed, absolutely dosed to the eyeballs with morphine. And it's funny. It makes me think, it's something I'm thinking about a lot presently, is the question of, what is personality if it can come and go like that? What is the self? Because we tend to believe that in cognitive decline, like I said, someone is irretrievably lost, but then there are these moments, often as someone's just dying, where they actually return to themselves, where you get that sense of the person they've been. And that was very much my experience with Dad, and one of the way I think of retrieving him and the memory of him in the poems is through hearing him speak and through thinking about the things he did say, would say, and those little moments of encounter with a person I thought I'd lost, in the last week of his life.
Because it's so palpable. I really felt like I could hear it, and it wasn't in your voice, it was like a deep version of your voice with a bit of a British accent. But yeah, I found it really very powerful. Would you like to read another poem? Should we have another? I was going to ask about Fax Peak, because I had invented that you'd written another.
Shall I read another poem?
Yeah, I would just really like to do Fax Peak.
Oh, okay, I'll read that one. All right, excellent. Pikes Peak, for those of you who don't know, our family lived in Colorado when I was in high school, and Pikes Peak is a really, really tall mountain. It's a mountain 14,000 feet above sea level in Colorado, and it's an absolutely dizzying kind of place to be. Pikes Peak. Hiking the timberline at 12,000 feet, my father mistakes an almost silent stroke for vertigo. Immobilization that arrives like a tsunami, the body withdrawing to its furthest reaches, brainstem stoppered for a paralysing second. He sits winded in a rubble of rose granite, staring at the infinite regression of quaking aspen, valley after valley to the horizon, stunned by his own elevation. Then fear, comprehension. He has lost the language for water, aspirin. An icy breeze shearing off snow, heads of spruce and bristlecone stretching all the way down to the switchback roads where motorcycles lean in terminal arcs. At this height, Everything grows deformed by wind and cold. Flag trees with a single comb of greenery down a leeward side. Krumholtz pines twisted into pretzel bends. Scratchings of alpine parsley, dwarf clover. Who knows exactly when it started or was over? A lightning storm in the skull, its barometer registering no drop in pressure. Then whole zones denuded like the palms after Castle Bravo. Detonation, raising stories of ocean to the sky. I gave myself a fright, he says, and shakes his head. A bull shifting a cloud of horseflies. Around my father, tundra grass is blowing, grain by stunted rain. This is the vista about which Catherine Lee Bates wrote America the Beautiful. The only line of which I ever remember is "Oh beautiful for pilgrim feet," which to me means precisely zero. But if I strain, I can still see him, sitting dumbfounded in that field of feldspar, his beautiful pilgrim feet laced into white Reeboks and gym socks, as a sunburst ripples through his brain. My father is calm as a monk whose long meditation produces imperceptible shifts in his physiognomy. And I understand he went up the mountain for the same reason everyone goes up mountains. He went up the mountain to change.
Very fun. This is, what I wanted to ask was, there's one poem in here where you really, the only time you directly confront, I guess, your own mortality. And of course, that's something that you would have been thinking about for the last 20 years. But I guess most people wouldn't be able to think about it so immediately, that it would be too painful, especially after just losing a parent. And I think the way, I don't know, I guess I just wanted to ask you about what it was like to not only have to confront that, but want to write about it in the same, just the fact of, you know what I mean?
You're talking about the poem The Odds?
Yes.
Yeah.
And just the sense of, I mean, you're watching time running out in front of you with a parent, but then you would also be feeling that for yourself and having to hold those two things in your mind.
I'm actually very grateful for, in a sense, being brought into contact early in my 20s with my mortality in a way that I think a lot of people in their 20s just have no concept of it whatsoever. And I think when Dad was diagnosed, I was pretty acutely aware that that time would be finite. And, I think for a lot of people in their early 20s, you still think your parents will last forever, and you have that sense. And I was very aware that that wasn't the case. And I was also aware of, I think, Dad's own regrets, that there are always things that you wish you'd done. There are always things that you think, oh, I'll leave that till I retire, etc. And there were things that I know that Dad wished that he was able to do that he hadn't done because he just lived for work and so forth. And so I don't regret. I think I've grown up as from the beginning of my adulthood with a very acute awareness of mortality. And the funny thing about Dad being diagnosed with Parkinson's, because he's so naive when you're sort of 18, I thought he'd die within 5 years. I really did. And I remember, this is the case. I'm sure there are people in the audience also who've had parents or loved ones with acute or terminal illnesses or illnesses with long gestation, and you do have these plateaus where you think, oh my God, this is going to be it, and then it's not. And then you think, oh no, this is going to be it, and then it's not. And I feel my entire adult life has been a period like that. And a friend of mine, actually, a poet, said to me when Dad actually died, it was one of the most profound things that anyone said to me after Dad's passing. He said, oh, the funny thing is about having a parent who's sick for that long, in a way you probably thought that it would last forever, because it did feel like such a long thing. It was such a shock when he actually died, because we've been through so many of those kind of moments of plateau. But your question was, I suppose kind of, I do think it is the poet and the writer's task to grapple with mortality. I think it's the great kind of challenge. It's something we repress actively and intensely in our daily lives, probably to our detriment. I think we'd live fuller lives if we learned culturally to deal with death in a more profound way, and to talk about it, develop a language about it, so that it isn't some taboo thing that happens to a group of people over there. You know, the way we handle it, certainly in Australia, it's essentially cordoned off in places like aged care homes and hospitals, and it's something that we kind of fear talking about, and don't therefore always have a great common language for. And I don't regret actually having to deal with that personally earlier than most people do. I feel it's given me a foundation in my adult life that I'm very grateful for. But yeah, writing about it is still tough to kind of have that moment of confrontation. And that poem that you're alluding to is a poem, I mean, something that I've been acutely aware of. So on mum's side, mum's mother had Parkinson's. My dad also had Parkinson's. So I'm aware that matrilineally and patrilineally, there's Parkinson's disease on both sides. It's not always genetic, but that is a poem just contemplating, you know, what are the odds of it happening to me, because that was always Dad's greatest fear. His dad was a brilliant person, he prized his mind. I prize my mind as well. You know, and we do have this fear of what happens to something, what happens if something happens to our brain, but I think ignoring it or repressing it doesn't really help us, doesn't get you anywhere. So I think it is something that if we all learn to actually confront this and contemplate it a little bit, we'd be better for it, I think.
Yeah, and then I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I guess once you are that aware of mortality and how ephemeral life is, you do notice everything in a very beautiful and interesting way. And I think that's one of the really unique things about your poems, is that just as a person, you're noticing everything all the time, because you thought things would end and would end and would end, and if you're always contemplating, I don't know, you do appreciate everything more, even if it's not good things, just having the experience of living becomes very precious. And I think that's what I've always found. That's how I think of the Sarah Holland-Batt poem, of seeing something in such a precise way, and not only that thing, but the thing next to it. And when I think, I don't know, whenever I hear, I don't know if it's pejorative, whenever I hear you're being referred to as an Australian poet, I just think it doesn't feel right, or an Australian poet who grew up in America also doesn't feel right. Because for me, your language is not informed by that set of cultural, I don't know, values, or that just cultural seem to me, your thinking, and I guess your reading and writing has always seemed quite borderless. And it's not that you were trying to look outward, it's as if the outward and inward things never divide, because you are just looking at everything. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of actually the appropriate term for what you're describing there is one coined by an Australian poet, Liz Murray, which is the idea of vernacular republic. You know, this idea that the poet is drawing on every language that they can muster, wherever that comes from. That is kind of your material. That's your, you know, like a sculptor is interested in clay and all the properties of clay, or a painter is interested in all the properties of paint. A poet, a writer is interested in all the properties of language. And I think there is a richness to be had, you know, in the Australian vernacular. And certainly there's a little bit of English vernacular in here, in Dad's kind of language, although peddling religion doesn't get a mention in the poems, so maybe for next book. But, you know, there is something to me really beautiful about localities of language. But I think you're limiting yourself if you only, you know, are focused on a particular vernacular, excluding them all. So maybe that's one way of kind of answering what your question is that, you know, I do believe in that idea of a kind of enormous and broad vernacular republic that's not just Australian, but is kind of, you know, English, which is a phenomenal language composed of, you know, kind of patchwork languages stretching back centuries, and what an incredibly rich kind of and diverse material that you have as a poet actually in your hands to work with. And I would hate to kind of, I don't know, hem myself in that way.
Yeah, because to me, it's always, even just when you speak in conversation, it just feels like it's a very singular language that's drawing from all these things. And just, I don't know, maybe people I guess it is kind of, you learn to say the things that you hear and you kind of stick with, this is how I should sound as an X, Y, Z. I don't know, even when I was revisiting Aria, I really felt that this poet could be from anywhere. She's just read everything. She's just interested in everything, and that's only developed even more. And then I think in this, because there is a real sense of there's less of a shield between, I guess, the speaker and the poem. It feels as a, I don't know, you know, it's a bit more direct. I think that combined with a kind of borderless language, I just think that's what makes it so brilliant, because it's everything you know, plus your voice in it.
Something that, as you're speaking, I'm sort of reflecting on, which is another gift of Dad. So I grew up in a great library. I grew up on the Gold Coast, which is not
Me
the
too.
most. I know. This is one of the things that you and I have in common. Growing up on the Gold Coast, the two and only poets ever from the Gold Coast.
It's not Indian heritage.
Well, you know, I have a little sliver of Indian heritage, not quite to the degree that you have, but you know, I think growing up on the Gold Coast, I was extremely lucky to have Dad's library. Dad was an enormous reader. He was a metallurgist that had this intense interest in philosophy, literature, writing, and I used to ransack those books and read things that were, I mean, Mum doesn't know all of it, wildly inappropriate. I mean, completely inappropriate. There was absolutely no supervision process whatsoever in terms of access to Dad's library. And, you know, and I knew more words than I knew how to pronounce, because, you know, Dad had some quite weird books and really fantastic books, excellent books in that library. And it's funny, Dad and I shared that certain thing, which is, you know, when you're an only child and you're a huge reader, and you're reading more books and you have the time to discuss with someone and no one else is reading the books either, you don't always know how to pronounce the words. You know the words and you know what they mean, but you don't always know how to say them. And I remember having a beautiful moment with Dad, because I'd had a childhood of that, of saying these words with great confidence, entirely with the wrong pronunciation, and having Mum or Dad correct me, you know, gently. And I had a beautiful moment of symmetry of that with Dad, when he was in his Parkinson's, you know, when it was like probably 2010 or something, we were sitting out again on the deck having a conversation, and Dad said something about, oh, such and such and such, and, you know, but that's a very old paradigm. And I said, I beg your pardon, Dad? And he said, oh, that's a very old paradigm. I said, oh, did you mean paradigm? And it was just this beautiful moment where I saw him, you know, we were so similar in that way. We spent our childhood in books, in language, you know, acquiring the beauty of language, and you know, these words live in your head and you think you know exactly what they mean, you know, with great confidence, you know, how to use them, but you don't always know how to pronounce them. Anyway, it's just a beautiful moment of symmetry. But yes, that, I think that's born out of a childhood spent in books, and again, that's something I see as descending through Dad and his interest in books as well.
I have no idea we're coming up to time, but I think that is a beautiful place to open up to audience questions if we have any. Otherwise, I can
read
very
too.
happily continue.
Yeah. Suze?
Yeah, I probably won't be able to use the words to use for this question, but in your long experience with your father in those 2 years, and you've been writing for 5 years, you thought to give to it so much knowledge of how they've been, you brought to it the things that you wanted to try to add, you brought to it all of your focus and your intelligence as you wanted it lies and depth. And I wondered if, with all of that focus and the intelligence you brought in one of those, have you ever experienced exactly like, I think it's kairos, like an illumination, about whether there was something more to life and something more to it, because you really belong to a depth, and working with together what for that, and I'm a really much important. This is a mission. I'm giving it my best shot.
I mean, it's a great question. So the question is kind of, the more you think about death, do you learn more about it? Do you have some kind of
I'm really talking about spirituality.
Spirituality.
I'm really talking about transcendence.
Yeah, I think it remains a mystery. And I've been really interested in this topic. This is not quite an exact answer to your question, but I've been reading a lot of neuroscience this year. I'm currently on a fellowship in a scientific kind of research facility and hanging out with neuroscientists. And I mean, that question of whether we can even fully comprehend what death is in the human mind is debatable, because for evolutionary reasons, we repress extremely strongly the knowledge and awareness of our own death. We respond really badly when we're reminded of it. There's all sorts of, experiments about the effect that, being exposed to our own mortality actually has on your behaviour, on the way you think about the world. It's I suppose the most intense confrontation you can have in your life is to contemplate your death. I don't know that I feel that maybe the way to answer your question is to say that even though these poems are about death, there are aspects of death that are totally ineffable, that language can't capture. And I think poetry as a form acknowledges that. Like, that's Mindy's question, isn't it? The poem as a form is fragmentary, it's composed of silence and speech. It's a form that isn't intent on saying everything exhaustively like prose is. And I think that's probably the best form to write about these ineffable experiences, a form that allows for some mystery and space. I don't feel that I have some full grasp on it. I do feel that the experience of watching Dad was, I don't know if spiritual is quite the right word, but the most profound experience of my life, and one that I'll carry with me. But I don't feel that I've said any sort of final word about it. I think it is an ineffable experience, an experience that escapes language, but the poem is in the attempt, if that kind of answers your question.
Yes.
Nothing to do with your father, but I'm looking at you and how you dress. It's a couple of good book, and there are two questions. I have read your book. Are you the Jaguar? And what's the significance of the title?
That's a great question. I'm not the Jaguar, though I am somewhat dressed in a Jaguar's size. There are a few different Jaguars in the book. There is the Jaguar, the animal, the apex predator, which, funnily enough, it wasn't a deliberate motif. It was something that I was looking through the poems and just noticed how many times the Jaguar as an animal. I mean, I'm fascinated by predation. I'm fascinated by the animal world, and that's something that's played a huge kind of role in my past books. My last book had an entire section kind of poems about predation and animals, and particularly I think those predators that are extremely good at disguising themselves. And the Jaguar is a total apex predator. The way it kills is it actually can puncture a skull with its jaw. That's the sort of degree of pressure it can bring to an animal's brain, which is amazing. They fascinate me, those animals. And so Jaguars were making these kind of murky appearances in the poem, not necessarily deliberately, but as I started looking at the poems, I thought, this is a really interesting kind of animal. And Jaguars have a long history in poetry. There's Rilke's The Panther. Ted Hughes has a fantastic poem two poems, in fact, about Jaguars, which are extraordinary. Ted Hughes is a huge influence on me. And so I sort of was thinking, it's an interesting avatar, for poetry, for the act of hunting down. And, I do think of these poems as an act of hunting down the right word, or hunting down the language for these experiences in which language is hard to kind of muster. But the second Jaguar in the car, in the book, is the car. And Dad, in his Parkinson's, just around the time when we were having conversations with him about potentially surrendering his license, bought a Jaguar car off eBay, sight unseen, and had it delivered to the house. Yes. And Mum was absolutely thrilled with that, completely thrilled with that. And he'd always wanted one. his brother-in-law, Chrissy's partner Jeff, had one, and Dad had always admired it. It was one of those things, you know, that you want and slightly regret that you haven't got. And then at some point, obviously, Dad just sort of bugger it, I'm having one, and bought one on eBay. And
Rolls Royce first, and I said no.
yes,
And I thought that was done.
yeah, he wanted a Rolls Royce. Mum said no to that, and then he just went and bought himself a Jaguar on eBay. And
Without saying.
but you know, it was kind of both beautiful that he had this thing that he wanted, but he got it slightly too late to have the full use and enjoyment out of it. And yeah, so there is a poem in the centre of the book that kind of grapples with how he handled that car, which was that he thought he was making improvements to it, but he wasn't, because he wasn't in his right mind. And so he's sort of tinkering with it and slightly wrecking it. But you know, he just really wanted to have it, and so he did. And so there's those two kinds of Jaguars, I suppose, in the book. So it's a multi-part answer to your question.
Would you like to close with the Jaguar gifts on Jackie?
Oh, we also have one Zoom question.
Sure, yeah, sure, go for it.
Which poets inspire you and why?
Which poets inspire me and why? Oh, that's a tough question because there's so many. I'll answer that. I think in this book, the poets who have loomed quite large for me, there's a wonderful contemporary American poet called Sharon Olds. People know her. Sharon supervised my master's degree when I was at NYU, and she's a stupendous poet. She's an interesting poet because she's written her entire career. She's written poems that seem to be about her life, and they're intensely confessional. People describe them as confessional poems, writing about her relationships with her parents, writing about her marriage, these very, very intimate poems. She always refuses to call them her, memoir. She's, she would insist, as I do, that there's a veil of fiction and artifice over a poem and license that the poet has to do what they want with their life and their materials. But she has a stupendous book called The Father, about her father's cancer, which I returned to a lot after Dad died, a beautiful book of elegies that was really inspiring me, I suppose, to find a way into these poems. And the other poet who I read a lot in writing this book was Kevin Young, who's also excellent contemporary African-American poet, wonderful poet who works a lot with music, jazz, blues kind of rhythms in his work. And he has a beautiful book called Book of Days about his father's death. I was interested in the way in which poets write these quite intense experiences and how you find a way to describe a relationship that spanned your entire life in the short space of a poem. And I thought he did so really, really beautifully in a different way. Sharon has a kind of intensity and confessional drive to her poems, and Kevin has an equally beautiful kind of emotional reckoning, but in a different kind of form. So those are two poets that inspired this book, and that's the shortest way of answering that question. The long list is very, very long. Yeah, that's part two of this long. Yeah, the long list.
No, please go ahead.
Could I ask a question?
Yes, sure.
What was the first line that you wrote that you were proud of?
What was the first line that I wrote that I was proud of? I mean, the first line that I wrote that I was proud of was probably when I was about 10. I remember we were given an assignment to write poems after Henry Lawson, and I remember going to the kitchen and reciting this dreadful bit of doggerel to Mum with like great enthusiasm, and I was extremely proud of that. But in terms of lines that I would say of poetry, I remember thinking in my first book, there was one poem that I was very confident was a good poem, which is the poem that ends it. It's a poem called The Art of Disappearing. And I remember finishing that and thinking, that's a poem. And I think it's a high bar, really. Like anyone can write a bit of writing that's the length of a poem. Does it elevate into something for the reader, I think is my question, or is it just my experience recorded for myself in words that I find meaningful personally? I think a poem is an act of communication for me ultimately, and the great poems that I've loved, I carry with me as though they're part of my own life, even though they're written by someone else, often in another century. They have that capacity to speak to someone, and I think that's probably my bar. And so it's funny enough, like a mentor of mine once said to me, "Oh, you're lucky if you've got one or two really good poems in your book." you know, if you're a poet, you're really aiming to write about 5 or 6 really great poems over a lifetime. And, you know, you write a lot of more poems than that, obviously, but, you know, there is that sense of a poem speaking out that I think you're always aspiring to. Not all poets do though. Some poets are writing for a smaller coterie or writing in jokes or writing for themselves. But I think to have that in mind is the poet's objective, I guess. Yeah. Should I close with
The poem.
EB? Go on.
Just read.
So through this journey, Sarah, Australia's business advocate for performing in aged care. As a leader in this space, is there one forward action that you would take?
That's a great question, Em. I think the main thing is that people think that aged care is not an election issue. And it was interesting that Labor made it one this time. I think the main call to action is, I would love it if everyone in this room wrote to their MP and said that they're expecting to see action on aged care in the first 100 years of this government, the first 100 days of this government. Sorry, 100 days. You know, this expectation, we have this sort of ghastly election cycle where all these promises are made and then, you know, a year later no one's really followed up on them or whatever. And, you know, I was disappointed to see aged care isn't in cabinet in this government. It should be a cabinet minister. And I think there's a worry that it could slip off the radar. So the call to action is write to the MP and say, you know, I voted in part on aged care and I expect to see action and reform in aged care within the first 100 days of this government. I would love to see that. That's I suppose my call to action. Yeah.
Thank you for that question, Emma. Let's close with the poem.
Okay, I'll close.
And then we'll have some sayings in that.
Thank you. And thank you, Mindy. This has been a lovely conversation. I'll close with this poem, The Gift. In the garden, my father sits in his wheelchair, garlanded by summer hibiscus, like a saint in a 17th century cartouche. A flowering wreath buzzes around his head, passionate red. He holds the gift of death in his lap, small, oblong, wrapped in black. He has been waiting 17 years to open it and is impatient. When I ask how he is, my father cries. His crying comes as a visitation, the body squeezing tears from his ducts tenderly as a nurse measuring drops of calamine from an amber bottle, as a teen at the car wash wringing a chamois of suds. It is a kind of miracle to see my father weeping this freely, weeping for what is owed him. How are you? I ask again, because his answer depends on an instant's microclimate. His moods bloom and retreat like an anemone as the cold currents whirl around him, crying 1 minute, sedate the next. But today, my father is disconsolate. I'm having a bad day, he says, and tries again. I'm having a bad year. I'm having a bad decade. I hate myself for noticing his poetry, the triplet that should not be beautiful to my ear, that is day, year, decade, scale of awful economy. I want to give him his present, but it is not mine to give. We sit as if mother and son on Christmas Eve, waiting for midnight to tick over, anticipating the moment we can open his present together. First, my father holding it up to his ear and shaking it. Then me helping him peel back the paper, the weight of his death knocking. And once the box is unwrapped, it will be mine. I will carry the gift of his death endlessly. Every day I will know it, opening in me.
This has been my 2013 self's dream come true. The Jaguar can be bought from our lovely host, Avid Reader Inside, and Sarah, I believe will be doing some signings now.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Thank you, Avid Reader. Thank you, Fiona, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks
for being
everyone
here.
on Zoom too.
Thank you, everyone on Zoom.
Thank you everyone on Zoom. Thank you. Okay. Ah. Thanks, Jerry.